Okay, so now we're going to look at the capture functionality on the Quad Cortex. So this actually uses machine learning, similar to some other modelers and probably very similar to the proprietary techniques that most amp modelers use to develop the internal models. But in this case, they've given it to us in a process that we can actually make our own models of our own gear rather than just relying on what the developers profiled. To get you back up to speed with the current setup here, I have one of the rhythm DIs from the demo song that I was showing you, and I am back in the analog mode of recording. That is, I have Pro Tools set to use the Scarlett Focusrite interface here, and then I am sending the DI signal out of line out 3 again into the radial reamper, then from the radial reamper into input 1 of the Quad Cortex. And this is just going to allow me to have a DI playing while I dial in the amp tone that I'm going to capture here, rather than having to play guitar the whole time. If I play this back just with our EQ matched rhythm preset that we made earlier, we are getting it on a stereo track here in Pro Tools so that we can hear what's coming out of the Quad Cortex. I'll just play that back for you now. We can see we have the DI coming in on input 1 here at a healthy volume. Maybe we'll just bump it up just a little bit with the clipper. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to go back to the grid, and to start the capture process, what we're going to do is go into the Quad Cortex file menu here, and then we're going to go to New Neural Capture. So when we start the capture process, it's going to guide us in helping us set up the I/O, both on the Quad Cortex itself, on our audio interface, and on the piece of gear that we're trying to capture. Again, we have our instrument plugged into input 1 already, which is effectively the DI that's being reamped. You could also just play a guitar, plug it in directly. It says, for best results, disconnect any additional inputs and outputs that aren't being used here. I don't have anything connected. In my personal experience, that hasn't affected the results of this process, but if you're trying it for the first couple times, maybe just leave those disconnected just to be sure. But it hasn't caused a problem for me. So if I hit the next button here, it says connect your headphones and or use out 1 to 2 or 3, 4 for monitoring. So this whole time, we're kind of going to be going in between signals that are being sent to the Quad Cortex, and then the amp signal that's also coming into the Quad Cortex, and then the virtual amp signal. So all of that is going to be coming out the main outputs, or if you use the headphone jack. So if I hit next now, it says connect capture out to the front or the input of the target device. So we haven't used this capture out jack yet. And this is reserved for this process. But all we're going to do is run an instrument cable here, so you can see, from the capture out into the front of the amp. In this case, we're just going to profile an amp, a cab, and a mic. Although if I had a boost pedal in front of that, I would run it from the capture out into the front of the boost pedal. So the beginning of whatever rig it is that you're trying to capture. I'll go ahead and hit next because I have this cable connected to the input of the 5150 over here. Then it says, position your mic in front of the cabinet and connect it to input 2. If you have an amplifier that has a DI out or a reactive load box, you can opt to use that instead of a microphone. So as I mentioned earlier, if you try to run a tube amp without connecting it either to a load box or a cab, you're probably going to damage either the head, the cab, or any number of other things that are connected to it. So just make sure that you observe the basic rules of guitar amps and have your amp connected to a load. And this is just reminding us that we don't have to capture the mic signal if we don't want to. If we just want to capture the sound of the head itself and leave the cab and the mic out of the equation, we can either take the effects return or run the output of the head into a load box and capture that. In this case, we're just going to keep things simple and run the output of the head into this 2x12 cab, and I've got an SM57 on the cap edge, just kind of the standard place that you would start with a rhythm tone here. So we haven't actually tested any signal yet, but this is all connected. So I have a microphone. This SM57 is on the cab. This mic cable from the SM57 is coming in to input 2. as it has instructed us on the screen here. I'm gonna hit the next button. It says, once everything is connected correctly, you can proceed with creating your neural capture. So we can always X out of this and come back to it if we need to adjust something or if we mess something up along the way. But I think we are set up correctly for this process. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit next. Okay, so now we have this kind of menu, which is similar to our I/O display, in that we have these input levels and the meters, so we can kind of have control over some of the I/O settings here while we're doing the capture. On the first page, we have input levels, input types, so we're gonna have to change this second input to a mic because we're recording the mic on the cab, so I'm just gonna hit that. So on page 2 here, we have options for lifting the ground on outputs, inputs, and then we have a phantom power for input 2. So that mic could be going straight to the Quad Cortex, where we use the Quad Cortex's preamp, and then the phantom power if we need it. Or we could run it to an external preamp if you have an outboard preamp that you want to use. And then the output of that preamp would go into input 2 here. And that preamp would be supplying the phantom power if necessary. In this case, we're using a dynamic mic, so we don't need to provide phantom power. I'm gonna go ahead and we'll start getting some signals so that we can tell if we need to lift any grounds. Hopefully we won't have to. I'm gonna go back to the first page here. If we need to reference the connection diagram, again, we can check that using the same graphics that it showed us before. So if I proceed with this and I'm not getting any sound or there's a problem, then I may reference that again. Okay, so the next step is I'm gonna go over to the amp and just double check that it is plugged into the cab and that the jack is all the way in, because that's happened to me before where you think the amp is plugged into the cab, but the jack is only like halfway in. So we're gonna do that, let the amp warm up, and then we'll go from there. So just to make sure that we're getting sound, I'm gonna start on the clean channel with the gain down and the volume down on both channels. Let's see if we're getting some sound here. So now when I'm in this menu, I should be able to either play guitar or run the DI through the reamp box into the input, and then it will send that DI out of the capture out into the amp to make sure that everything is set up right. So the next step is going to be to actually make sure that signal is going to the amp and that we're getting a tone. So I'm gonna hit play on Pro Tools. It's gonna send the DI out of the reamp box into input 1 of the Quad Cortex, which when I'm in this menu is then going to be sent out of the capture out and into the front of the amp. So I'm going to disengage the standby on the amp after I hit play, and then we will try and dial in some sort of tone, and then make sure that we're getting the signal back in on input 2 out of the mic, and make sure that that signal is healthy here. So first, hit play, turn standby off, make sure we're getting a tone. Here we go. If you notice though, the SM57, you need to drive it with a lot of volume to get it to really come in at a healthy level, especially for something like a guitar amp. So you can treat this kind of like your preamp gain in this case, like the preamp gain on your interface or on an external preamp. So I'm just gonna turn up the input 2 level a good bit. You know, normally you might not be setting one of these knobs in a virtual guitar amp to plus 40 dB, but since this is a preamp, it's kind of actually designed to boost it by a lot. So again, just think of this like the preamp gain on your interface or on an external pre. So I'm just gonna dial that up until the level hits about where we would expect it to land on this meter here. You can see it's actually digitally adjusting the gain of the preamp, and that's why there's that kind of dropout sound as I was playing back. It's just kind of an artifact of what happens when you're digitally adjusting the gain on one of these devices. Okay, so that's looking good. We are getting the sound of the guitar through the cab into the microphone, and we're getting that on our track in Pro Tools. That's what we're previewing out of the outputs of the Quad Cortex. If you're having trouble dialing in the levels correctly, you can try the auto set levels. So if I hit that and then play back, it will kind of automatically try and set this to the optimal gain staging. So you can see it's about at the same preamp level, and it was reacting to the level coming out of the mic. So if a palm mute happened and the level jumped up, then it would duck the preamp gain a little bit. There's not really a great point to just immediately disengage, but just keep your eye on that input level. And then when you kind of get a sense of where the range that it's staying in, you can just disable the auto set and say, okay, I'm going to stick with this. In this case, 31 dB is the preamp gain that I'm going with on input 2. I think we are ready to actually start the capture. So when I do this, it is going to start sending some test tones instead of the DI out of the capture out and into the front of the amp through the cab and the microphone, and it's going to record that. That's going to take a minute or two, and then after it records the signal, it's going to spend some time doing the machine learning algorithm, which will take another 5-10 minutes, and then we will get to try out our virtual model against the real thing. So let's go ahead and do the start capture, and just beware that this is going to be loud. So if you're in the room with an amp, you might want to step out of the room. Okay, so now it has recorded those test tones, and you can see that it is in the training stage. So this is the way that most of these newer amp modeler softwares work when they're doing capture. The quality of the model is actually determined on how long this machine learning process is allowed to take. So on the Quad Cortex, it's kind of a fixed amount of time. And I personally wouldn't be surprised if, the neural capture process is gradually improved in the future over firmware revisions and future products and that sort of thing. So we're going to let this do its thing, and we will come back at 100% and audition our new virtual amp. Okay, so the machine learning process is done. It says your neural capture is ready. With this interface, we can actually just kind of make sure that the capture process worked and see how accurate it is. In this setup, it's similar to right before we did the capture, where anything coming into our input 1 is going to go out to the guitar amp, but it's also going to go to its internal model. And then I will be able to switch between the two using this. So this is going to switch the playback from the Quad Cortex's capture that it just made coming out of the main outs. And then when I hit this A and it switches to reference, then it's going to be playing the signal coming from the mic out of outputs in 1 and 2. So I am in the same room as the amp, so it's pretty loud in here. So in order to hear the Quad Cortex's model compared to the reference, what I'm going to do is just record the output of the Quad Cortex onto a track, and then record the output of the mic onto a track, and then I can compare and hear the model without the amp in the room. But if you have your cab in like an isolated room, then you don't have to do this, and you can just hear it without committing to a track. So let's do that real quick. I will hit record on this track. I'm going to label this QC for Quad Cortex. And so this is going to be a recording of the DI through the model that the Quad Cortex just made. Okay, let me duplicate this track without the audio data on it, and then I'm going to rename it to amp. I'll mute this one and then record it on this one. So now we are going to record the signal coming out of the mic and the real amp. So for comparison purposes, let's hit record. Okay, good. Now let's go ahead and hit the standby on the amp so that when I hit play, it's not playing back through the amp. I'll mute my DI track here. And then now I can just flip between having the Quad Cortex signal muted and the amp signal muted. So pay attention to this little mute indicator. So I'm going to start with the amp and then switch back and forth to the Quad Cortex and then back. That is very, very close. There is something I might be hearing in the low mids that feels a little bit different, but I can't even really put a descriptive adjective to it. They're just very, very close. And I couldn't really tell you offhand which one I think sounds better either. So that is, I think, a pretty good demonstration of the power of this process. I mean, it's very fast, as you saw. It only takes about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to make a model of something. Okay, so that's sounding pretty good. Let's go ahead and save our capture here so that we can use it on the grid with other components. I'm going to hit save blue for the blue channel. So I would just recommend being as descriptive as possible with the name, maybe include the date, or in this case, I'll include the cab and the mic that I used. I'll say 2 by 12 and then 57. So that's pretty descriptive. I think I'll be able to remember that, but whatever works for you. And then here, we can assign some metadata similar to how we were saving presets. So this helps other people find your capture when you upload it to the cloud, if you do. If you're using this on the grid, you can assign these different icons to it so that when it appears on the grid as a device, you'll know it's a capture of either an amp, a combo, a head and a cab, just a cab, or just a pedal. So that's kind of the idea here. In this case, we're doing a head and a cab, so I'm going to select that so that I know what this is a capture of, and I'm going to select guitar because we are using it for guitar. That doesn't actually change the sound of anything with the capture, it's just for organizational purposes. So now that I'm done with that, I can hit the check mark, and we're taken back to our rhythm EQ match preset. So if I wanted to repurpose this preset for use with the capture we just made, I would just drag and delete the cab and the amp from the grid here. And then I could go into the grid and go to Neural Capture, go to My Captures, and then go down to the 5153 Blue V1 Mesa 2x12 that we just made. So now you can see that we have our capture ready to go in our preset, and we can then tweak some of these tone stack options too. If we feel like it needs just a little more treble, a little more gain, whatever, we can do those sorts of tweaks there. Okay, so that's a brief overview of how you would capture an amp and a cab through a mic. Next, we're going to show you how to capture just the head using a load box.